All right, here we're going to take a look at using the rand function, and we're going to basically use that to simulate situations where we come up with these density curves. So remember, density curves have an area of 1 underneath them, and all probabilities should be between 0 and 1. So let's take a look. These are going to be continuous probability density curves. So the first part of this, let's look at a random real number between 1 and 2. So we're going to kind of look at what that distribution looks like, and we're going to use the rand function. So this is different from rand between, right? So when we say a random number between 1 and 2, that means things like 1.3 or 1.47296, right? So we do not want to use rand between. Rand between will only give us 1 or 2, right? So if I do equals rand between, it would help if I spell it right. But if I do rand between and do 1 comma 2, then this is just going to give me a 1 or a 2 every time. So anytime I do something else in the cell, we get a bunch of 1s, we get a bunch of 2s, right? We're just going to get 1s and 2s. So we don't want that. Instead, what we want to do is use the rand function. So equals rand. What this function does is it gives us a number between between 0 and 1, right? So how do I change that? Well, we basically look at the range of these numbers first, and we say, well, these numbers go from 1 to 2. Okay, the range between them is just 1. So that's where I start. I say, okay, the range between them, right? This is just a distance of 1. So 2 minus 1. There's our range. And the reason I bring this up is because it won't always be the case. So for example, the distance between 1 and 0.5, of course, is 0.5. The distance between 6 and 10, you always take the bigger number minus the smaller number, and then you get a distance of 4, right? And this one we'll get to in a minute. So those ranges matter because the rand function has a range of 1, right? If it's a number between 0 and 1, that range, smallest to largest, is 1. So for the first one, random number between 1 and 2, I don't need to change that range. So that range is good. All I need to do is shift it. So basically, in this next step, we're going to say, all right, shift this by 1 to get numbers between 1 and 2. All right, so how do I shift this random number here by 1? Well, I guess I could just do a random number and then say plus 1, right? That way, the smallest number, it was 0, but if I add 1 to that, it bumps it up to 1. The biggest number was 1. If I add 1, it bumps it up to 2. So now I should get something like this. So here's 1.3266. And if I drag this thing, remember the random function doesn't reference a specific cell, so you can just drag it any which way you'd like. You can turn it into an array if you would like. And notice all of these numbers right here are definitely between 1 and 2, right? Some of them are much closer to 2, some of them are much closer to 1. And so if we want to simulate a scenario where we're picking a random number between 1 and 2, we probably want to do, I don't know, maybe about 100 of these. So remember, if we're going to create a histogram, which is what this says to do, provide a histogram, we're going to need everything in one row or one column. So let's kind of go down and do, I don't know, about 100 of these maybe. So I'm going to go here. I think that'll be 100 because we didn't use the first cell that was showing numbers between 0 and 1. Okay, so those are already highlighted. I dragged it down, so they're already highlighted. I am going to insert. I can either do recommended charts, or if I know I want a histogram, I can go straight to histogram. That's fine. So here's my histogram. Right now it's got 5 bars. So if I want to change 5 bars or 5 bins, if I want to change that, we know we can change that. If we want to add labels, we know we can use this little plus symbol to add some labels. So there's a bunch of things we can do. So one thing we might say is, give this thing a title. So random numbers between 1 and 2. Right, and really what I should be saying is this is an approximation for the density curve, right? It's a histogram, but we're going to draw in the density curve. So, all right, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to format the axis, and again, depending on whether you have a Mac or a PC, you'll format this a little differently, so you may have to click on the bars themselves. So we format the axis. Let me move this over a little bit so we get it in full view here. Okay, so let's say I wanted a different number of bins. Maybe I want 10 bins instead. All right, so let's see what that looks like. 10 bins, and let me get this out of here so we can see the full view. All right, it looks something like this. Now, this has kind of got some ups and downs, ups and downs. Now, in theory, this should be relatively flat all the way through, but I only did 100 random numbers, so it's not going to be very good. Notice, though, remember, if I type something in a cell, those random numbers are going to change, meaning my histogram is going to change. So if I do this a few times, right, we kind of see different iterations showing up, and some of them look a little bit more flat than others. Right, so I'm just going to grab one of these. So this one looks about right. If I wanted to make this more accurate, I would probably do 200 or 300 random number simulations. But this is the idea. So I want this guy. So I'm going to copy and paste that over here. Let's see. All right, cool. So copied and paste this guy over here. And really the part we're interested in is the approximation of the density curve. So what are we really going for? Well, we're kind of saying, like, does this thing have curvature to it? Well, we already talked about, and unfortunately, let's see, when I made that a little bit smaller, it took the y-axis away, so we don't want that. Okay, so we already talked about that really, in theory, we should have gotten, you know, kind of a nice flat curve here. So there were a few where we had a little bit more and a few where we had a little bit less. That's fine, that happens. But we should have a pretty flat curve here for these random numbers if we're selecting just one random between two values. If we're doing sums or something like that, it's going to change. But this is the idea. Okay, so then let's say, well, what if instead I wanted to have a random number between 0.5 and 1. So I'm going to say, well, let me just rework what I want to do here. So I no longer want to shift by 1, and I don't even want to shift by 0.5, right? Because if my lowest value is 0.5, my highest value, if I bump that up, would have to go to 1.5. So I'm not going to add a number, right? And I'll show you what I mean. So if I added, so if I say, well, maybe I think I need to add 0.5. And some of this is investigation, right? If we're not totally sure. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to bring this down. Now here's the problem. We already see a bunch of numbers here that are not between 0.5 and 1. We get a bunch of numbers like this, 1.199. This is above 1. This is above 1. We get a bunch of these numbers above 1. So adding 1 was not the solution, right? So let's go back here and say, well, what if instead of adding 1, I looked at my range, right, which was 0.5, and I multiplied this random number by 0.5. So 0.5 times a random number. Let's see, what do we think this is going to do? Well, if I, right, and don't forget to drag it. Now I get a bunch of numbers, 0.44, 0.27, 0.489. We get a bunch of numbers between 0 and 0.5. So we address the range part, right? We do have the right range. We only have a range of 0.5, but I need to shift these up now. So let's take these and shift up by 0.5 as well. So we're going to take what we have. We multiplied by 0.5 to sort of shrink the range. But now it only goes from 0 to 0.5. If I want it to go between 0.5 and 1, so to get numbers between 0.5 and 1, then we're going to say, okay, 0.5 times the random, but then I need to also bump it up by 0.5. So there's only two possibilities we're going to do for these, which is multiply by something that affects the range. So if you have a range of something other than 1, multiply. And then we're going to shift as needed. So once we've sorted out the range, we can add or subtract. Usually we're going to add as needed. So here we go. Now if I do this, and then let's fill in. Let's look at our list of numbers, the ones that are in gray right now. So I see 0.64, 0.81, 0.84, 0.63. Okay, these are all looking like numbers that are between 0.5 and 1. So it feels like I've done this correctly. I don't see anything that goes below 0.5. I see some that are kind of close, right? I got a couple of values right here close. I have some values that are close to 1, 0.98, for example, 0.988, but I don't see anything going over 1. So this looks like the winner. right? This looks like what I want to do. Now, right now, technically I only have 99 values. I'm going to go even a little further here and say, well, what if I go down to like about 200 values, right? Somewhere here. And I should have mentioned that you can click Control Shift and it'll bring you to the end. So if I start at this cell and I do Control or Command Shift and then hit down, it'll highlight all of those. So you don't have to drag it down if you want to insert. So we already showed insert histogram, or you can do recommended charts, and it'll give you a bunch of weird ones, right? But we want the histogram. So here we go. We can adjust this again, format our axis. So we can say, well, let's take a look. Number of bins. So let's just try, well, let's do, I don't know, just for something a little bit different, let's do 8 bins instead. All right, so we get something like this. Let me get this out of here. So here's 8 bins. Looks like we have a lot of these values in the early going and then a lot sort of in the middle. And so let's do what we've done before, which is, let me just try another simulation. So just put something in a cell. Okay, this one looks a lot more even. How about another one, right? This one looks a little bit more kind of jagged. Right, this one looks a little bit more even with some peak. So you can kind of mess around with this and get different simulations, or you can just add more numbers, right? The larger the number, kind of like the law of large numbers, the larger the sample you have, probably the closer this is going to be to theoretical. And what we know is that theoretically, right, each number between our two values should be equally likely. So if I pull this guy over, right, I'm kind of choosing to pull one over that does look a little bit better, right? So our density curve is approximated, again, just sort of by a horizontal line here, and some values will be above, some will be below. We don't want to kind of get too pulled away by little values that are up and down, but if you see like an obvious pattern, then by all means, make that your overall pattern. Okay, so this is at least the initial idea. I'm going to finish this one off in a second video in just a moment.